Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the smoky, dough-dusted world of Ottoman Istanbul. You're barefoot on cold cobblestones, trailing through a narrow alley where the air smells like ash, yeast, and faintly of cardamom. The sky is pitch black above, pierced only by a sliver of moon and the warm orange flicker leaking from a half-open wooden door ahead. You duck inside, and just like that, you're in an Ottoman bakery at midnight. Inside, it's hot. Not cozy hot. Blast furnace, you might faint hot. A line of dome-shaped ovens, tender, belch flames. Bare-armed men and boys knead, slap, and toss dough like they've been doing this since birth. They probably have. You dodge a flying lump of dough and slide past the teenage apprentice who looks like he hasn't slept since the last crescent moon. This place doesn't stop. Not for night. Not for holidays. Not even for sultans. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the heart of an empire, and this isn't just any bakery. This is a fire-in, licensed by the state, sanctioned by the guild, and watched by the divine. You're here because tonight, you're going to understand why a baker in Ottoman Istanbul had to memorize exactly 87 different official bread sizes. Not 86. Not 88. 87. Every one of them codified, sacred, and subject to inspection by men with ledgers and very sharp knives. In the flickering light, the walls are lined with shallow wooden drawers, each labeled with curling Arabic script and a strange symbol beside it: a horseshoe, a crescent, a pinecone, a dagger. You slide one open and pull out what looks like a petrified bun. It's rock hard, crumbly, and heavy in your hand, like a bread fossil. That's because it is. These are the official samples, the moldy relics of loaves from years past, preserved to train apprentices and silence any baker who dares challenge the guild's standards. You put it back gently. It smells like time. Behind you, a tall, rail-thin man with a mustache that could cut glass is rolling dough with mechanical precision. His eyes flick to you briefly, then return to his work. You hear him mutter under his breath. Ekmek yetmiz yedi, tam gram you see parmak boy. Bread number 77, exact weight, 3 fingers high. He's testing himself. Over and over. Because if he gets it wrong tomorrow when the inspector comes, that's it. The guild might fine him. Or shutter the shop. Or worse, public punishment. Stocks. A flogging. A loaf nailed above the door with the word, Hain, traitor, burned into the crust. You don't want that. You're starting to realize this isn't just about baking. Bread in this empire is an obsession. It's not an exaggeration to say the Ottoman Empire ran on dough. Literally. Taxes were measured in it. Rations were based on it. Entire cities, including this one, were judged by the scent of their bread at dawn. One famous traveler even claimed he could tell which district he'd wandered into by the crust density. That's either nonsense, or the most delicious GPS ever invented. A popular urban myth, still whispered in Istanbul cafes, says that bakers would train for years, blindfolded, identifying bread types by smell, weight, and the sound it made when tapped. That's probably exaggerated, but not by much. Guilds held secret tests. Trainees had to identify the difference between Yassi ekmek and Topan ekmek, between wheat, rye, and barley, all in regulated proportions, all with defined moisture levels. Think of it like baking mixed with trigonometry, but your calculator is a blistered hand and your teacher hits you with a peel if you hesitate. One weird historical footnote? Some bakeries allegedly used eggplants as test weights when metal was too expensive. You'd better hope it was the right season or you'd be estimating grams by guessing the feel of a vegetable. This is real. It's in a diary written by a vizier's cook, although historians still argue whether that was a joke, or if Ottoman bakers really kept an eggplant scale behind the kneading table. You duck out of the way again as an apprentice rushes past with a long paddle. Correct. Balanced with 10 perfect loaves, all brushed with water and nigella seeds. They go into the oven with a single graceful shove. 10 minutes later, they come out glistening and golden brown, singing softly as they crackle in the air. But before they cool, another apprentice grabs one and places it on a brass balance scale. He squints, frowns, then mutters to himself again. 3 grams over. USTA won't be pleased. He's right. The head baker walks over, frowns deeply, and with an infuriating calmness tosses the offending loaf to the floor. The boy blushes. The loaf is 3 grams off the expected weight for that particular size. Which, for the record, was loaf number 46. Fatma Ana Samunu. Or, Fatma's mother's round. Named after some long-forgotten woman who may or may not have invented the recipe during a siege. Her round loaf lives on. She does not. So why all this drama over bread weight? Because it kept the peace. In a city as packed and poor and hot-blooded as Ottoman-era Istanbul, food fairness was a pressure valve. You underweight a loaf by 5 grams, and that's not just theft, that's blasphemy and betrayal and probably treason. You do it enough times and people riot. Like, actual flaming carts in the street riot. There's a reason the Sultan's own records kept track of bread weights as closely as military movements. Even the Sultans themselves were reportedly obsessed. One palace account details how Sultan Bayezid II once disguised himself, like a royal Batman, and wandered the streets pre-dawn just to personally weigh bread from different stalls. That loaf from the Karakoy bakery? 2 grams light. The baker? Fined. The Sultan? Satisfied. You step back as the ovens roar. The baker's voice cuts through again. Remember number 34, it rises fast, burns faster. You nod, like you'll actually retain that. But here's the thing. They did. These bakers? They could recite all 87 types by heart. They had to. Because getting it wrong wasn't just a kitchen mistake, it was life or death. And this is just your first night. You blink the flour dust out of your eyes and edge closer to the heat, not because it's comfortable, but because it's hypnotic. The ovens radiate a glow that turns the entire room into something mythic, half bakery, half temple. It's easy to forget you're in the middle of a metropolis. A very hungry one. Outside, Istanbul stretches in every direction, a tangled mesh of mosques, markets, palaces, and street corner food stalls. But if you zoom out just slightly, think above rooftops, over the Bosphorus, across Anatolia and the Balkans, you begin to understand something crucial. The Ottoman Empire isn't just huge. It's mind-breakingly huge. And everywhere you go in it, whether you're in Damascus, Sarajevo, or Cairo, people eat bread. Every single day. And not just any bread. State-sanctioned bread. You step back from the ovens, wiping your brow, and catch a glimpse of a chalkboard. It lists today's allowed sizes and weights, scrawled in elegant Arabic calligraphy. There are margins, exact margins. Deviate too much, and your loaves don't just taste wrong, they become illegal. You're starting to get the picture. In the Ottoman world, bread is as regulated as gold. You're handed a half-round loaf to nibble, number 12, the Alaturka noon. It's nutty, dense, with a hint of molasses. Delicious. And totally standard issue. You notice tiny markings on the bottom of the crust. Those aren't decorations. They're gilt-stamped indentations, baker's signatures pressed in with a heated brass seal, so anyone could trace the loaf back to its maker. If something went wrong, if someone got sick, or worse, there was no hiding. And why all this fuss? Why the obsession? Because bread was how people survived. Not metaphorically. Literally. In a city where many couldn't afford meat, vegetables, or oil every day, bread was the calorie source. Ottoman bureaucrats knew this. So did religious authorities. Bread had to be affordable. It had to be accessible. And it had to be absolutely fair. It's said that if bread prices rose even slightly without explanation, people took to the streets faster than an earthquake drill. There are court records of women storming bakeries with rolling pins and curse words when the loaves got too thin. One poor baker reportedly had to hide in a pickle barrel for hours while a mob accused him of Crust fraud. Totally real case, or at least, that's what a Janissary's journal from 1674 suggests. Historians still argue whether it was exaggeration or if Istanbul really was that full of weaponized grandmas. You'd believe it though, especially once you learn about the city's daily consumption. By the 17th century, Istanbul had over 700,000 residents. That meant roughly 1 million loaves a day. Every morning. Rain or shine. Rich or poor. The state even subsidized flour during famines just to keep the ovens burning and the crusts coming out right. Walk through the city in daylight, and you'll see stacks of somen, pied, and bazlama on every corner, each slightly different in texture or flour content, but all obedient to the 87 category system, some round, some oblong, some with exactly 6 diagonal scoring marks. God forbid you use 5. The palace even had a designated chief bread officer. That was his actual job. He didn't just make bread for the Sultan, he monitored citywide loaf consistency, kept peace between rival bakeries, and occasionally weighed bread using a gold-plated balance. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, that one baker dared to invent a new loaf shape. His reward? A polite but firm exile to the eastern border. Bakers didn't innovate. They followed. Because deviation led to suspicion, and suspicion led to instability. Bread could be religious. The Friday Ramazan paidisi wasn't just soft and pillowy and full of sesame seeds, it was symbolic, tied to prayer and purification. A crooked loaf could be interpreted as disrespect. An underbaked loaf during fasting season? That could be seen as sabotage. Maybe even blasphemy. You don't want to get labeled a heretic by accident because your yeast rose weird. So the rules weren't just rules. They were security protocols. Imagine if today, every time your toast was too thin, you could report it to the city council. That was the Ottoman approach. They even had bread checkpoints. Yep, designated officers who randomly weighed loaves being sold at markets. They carried mini reference scales, and if a loaf came up short, boom. Confiscated. Sometimes eaten on the spot as a warning. Petty? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. You pass by another station where a young apprentice is being quizzed. His eyes are wild with exhaustion, but he rattles off. Loaf 33 barley sorghum mix, 312 grams, flat. Loaf 34 barley sorghum mix, 316 grams, domed. There's a 4-gram difference and a height variation, and he knows it. He doesn't blink. You watch him roll dough into perfect semi-domes and score them twice diagonally, because that's the visual cue for 34. It's practically a language. And this kid? He's fluent. There's something poetic, and slightly bonkers, about how this empire built so much of its stability on bread uniformity. You think of great civilizations with grand temples and elite warriors, but the Ottomans? They also had crust compliance officers. A strange fact pops into your mind: bakers were among the least punished professions in the empire. Why? Because the punishments for failure were so public and humiliating, no one wanted to mess up. Imagine standing in the market square with a misshaped loaf hanging around your neck like a sign of shame. That happened. There are etchings. Of course, not every city followed the rules equally. Provincial towns, places far from the capital, had looser standards. But the Istanbul bakers? They were elite. Their guilds had connections all the way to the Sultan's inner circle. A whisper from the bakery district could topple a vizier. And if there was unrest? The first place inspectors went was the ovens. Was the bread light? Was it too dense? Had someone tampered with the flour supply? Because when bread was wrong, something else was usually wrong too. You sit down now, your back against a flour barrel, and watch another batch emerge from the fire. These loaves crackle louder this time, fresh wheat, high hydration, wide bloom. The smell is so good it almost hurts. And suddenly, you're wondering, who counted the 87 sizes? Why not 88? Or 100? The bakers? The guild? The palace? You'll find out soon. But for now, you've earned a break. Just don't touch loaf 42. No one talks about loaf 42. You stretch out your legs and let the warmth of the oven lull your limbs into a dull, doughy haze. Around you, the pace slows just a little. Not because the work is over, please, never that, but because the first major batch has left the fire. The air smells like roasted sesame, steam, and something faintly metallic, maybe copper trays being scraped down, maybe just stress. In the corner, an older baker is teaching a boy how to measure loaves using the old system. No scales, no rulers, no fancy marked weights. Just walnuts and coins. And you blink, because this isn't some nostalgic gimmick, it's the backup plan. In case of famine. In case of fire. In case your measuring tools get confiscated during an audit, which, yes, could totally happen. You inch closer and watch. First, the man pulls out a small sack. From it, he lays down 8 walnuts in a perfect line. He places a small round loaf next to them. "Tam," he says. "Full weight." Then he pulls out a tarnished coin, silver maybe. It's about the size of your thumbnail. Places it atop another loaf. Nods. "Halfpenny standard." You've wandered into a world where money isn't just for buying bread, it's for measuring it. Before official guild scales were standardized in the 1600s, Ottoman bakers often used items of known mass as stand-ins for precise weights. Walnuts. Copper coins. Lead weights shaped like birds. The idea was simple. If everyone agreed a coin weighed X, and your loaf needed to weigh 5X, you didn't need a scale, you just needed some coins and a good eye. And when you're kneading 300 loaves a morning, a good eye is code for semi-magical perception of weight fluctuation through your palms. Of course, this led to some creative cheating. Certain bakers were caught hollowing out walnuts or filing down coins to give their loaves a false pass. One particularly enterprising soul was busted after his competitor noticed that his standard walnut floated. Turns out, it was a painted cork. That little trick earned him a 2-week bakery ban and a compulsory workshop on ethical loafing. Historians still argue whether these counterfeiting practices were widespread or just a few bad seeds, but the stories linger in dusty guild ledgers all the same. Eventually, the guild cracked down. New policies introduced the dirham, the official weight unit of the empire, derived from Old Arabic and Persian measures. A loaf of basic daily bread was required to weigh precisely 644 dirhams, about 430 grams. And to ensure no confusion, bakers had to carry standardized weights made of brass or iron, sometimes inscribed with the Sultan's tugra, or imperial signature. But the quirks didn't vanish overnight. In certain neighborhoods, bakers continued to pass down walnut-based calibration traditions for generations. In rural Anatolia, even well into the 1800s, village bakers could still be seen balancing dough in hand while muttering about 4-coin lightness, or half-olive heft. It sounds silly, until you try it. You pick up a small round of dough and suddenly wonder if you, too, could feel the difference between a 6-walnut loaf and a 7-walnut one. Probably not. But the thought's fun. And then there's the whole issue of loaf dimensions. You assumed weight was the only thing that mattered. Think again. The Ottoman bread registry, yes, that's a thing, also included specifications for diameter, height, and crust type. One regulation from 1691 mandates that the daily ration loaf must be no less than 6 fingers wide, and rise no higher than the length of a man's thumb. Whose thumb? Unclear. Probably some guy named Mehmet. But these semi-subjective units became law. That's where the guild symbols came into play. You walk back toward the wooden drawer wall, the one you saw earlier, and open another compartment. This one contains a strange metal ring. It's dull from age and shaped like a wreath. An apprentice explains, this was used to test a specific loaf's diameter. If your bread didn't fit snugly inside the ring, no more, no less, you were off size. Some bakers even had wooden stamps carved in the outline of a proper loaf, so they could press them onto raw dough like cookie cutters. What you're seeing is nothing short of a civilizational obsession with bread geometry. There's even an infamous dispute recorded in a court archive where two bakeries fought over a unique loaf shape, the double crescent. Each claimed they invented it. The case dragged on for weeks, and the ruling? They were both fined for inventing new loaf shapes without guild approval. The moral? Be boring. Stay inside the 87. But why walnuts and coins in the first place? It turns out, the Ottomans weren't alone in this approach. Ancient Romans used beans. Some medieval Germans used rocks. But the Ottomans refined it. They respected it. There's even a guild poem from the 18th century that lists objects and their symbolic bread values. It's oddly beautiful. One line translates to: "A walnut speaks the weight of a man's hunger. A coin his debt. A crust his honor." They weren't joking around. You take a walnut from the table and roll it in your palm. It's smooth, familiar. The idea that thousands of bakers across centuries used this little thing as their daily compass makes the bakery feel suddenly larger, like it's connected to something timeless. Then a bell rings, sharp, metallic, and urgent. A delivery cart's here. A runner barks a series of numbers. 18. 34. 71. The bakers spring into action, tossing dough rounds and stretching rectangles like they've been rehearsing this all their lives. You realize they probably have. Because each of those numbers? They aren't just orders. They're categories. Loaf 18 is a market loaf, dense, transportable, slightly salty. Loaf 34 is a worker's ration, domed, golden, moderate chew. Loaf 71 is a fasting special, slightly underbaked for flexibility, no toppings. And someone somewhere will expect them all to be correct, down to the gram. Not close. Not approximate. Correct. You feel a shift, a strange mix of awe and sympathy. You've seen chefs stress before. You've watched line cooks under pressure. But Ottoman bakers? These people were under a different kind of microscope: historical, religious, bureaucratic, and literal. Their lives were ruled by loaves. Each crust a compliance form. Each crumb a verdict. And if the walnuts don't line up, someone's head rolls. Figuratively. Usually. You haven't even shaken the flour out of your sleeves when the room stills. Not a loud stillness, but something dense, like air thickening before a storm. Then, out of the haze of yeast and soot, a figure appears in the doorway. The baker's tense. Hands freeze mid-knead. The apprentice nearest the oven subtly wipes his palms on his apron and mutters something under his breath. Might have been a prayer. Might have been a curse. Hard to tell. The man steps forward. He wears a charcoal robe, not black, but so dark the candlelight barely clings to it. His belt is wide leather, covered in pouches. He has a notebook in one hand. And the other? Empty for now, but you know it could just as easily hold a blade or a branding iron. This is the Mutisib, the Imperial Market Inspector. And he's here for your bread. Now don't be fooled by the soft-shoed silence, or the perfectly folded sleeves. This guy wields more daily power than most provincial governors. Appointed by the Sultan himself, or at least his ministers, the Mutisib is part bureaucrat, part spy, part inquisitor. His job? Keep markets honest. Monitor weights and measures. Prevent fraud. And critically, make sure every baker is obeying all 87 bread sizes to the letter. You gulp. The tension's so thick it could be scored like dough. He glides past the ovens, eyes flicking across loaves cooling on wooden racks. He doesn't touch. Not yet. He points to one, murmurs, Odas Dokas, number 39. The head baker nods grimly and removes it from the shelf. Places it on the marble slab. A hush falls. The inspector takes a tiny brass balance scale from his pouch, already calibrated, of course, and a stamped weight marked 412 g. He places it gently on one side. Then the loaf. The arms of the scale waver. The needle trembles. Then settles. Perfect balance. The room exhales. But this isn't over. Not even close. He's just getting started. The Mutisib begins pulling random loaves off shelves, pointing, weighing, tapping the crust with his knuckles like he can hear deception in the hollow. He brings out a small measuring rod, decorated with geometric carvings, and checks a loaf's diameter. Another is sliced in half, its crumb inspected like it might contain state secrets. One apprentice whispers that if an air pocket is too big, it could be deemed a sign of sloppy kneading, or intentional deception. Apparently, that's a real offense. Deliberate aeration with intent to deceive, punishable by fine or public shaming. Historians still argue whether it was ever actually enforced, or just something officials made up to scare the apprentices. Either way, nobody's smiling. The Mutisib's face remains unreadable. Occasionally, he writes something in his ledger, carefully, with a quill so sharp it seems to whistle as it scratches. You think of modern-day health inspectors with clipboards and hairnets. This is not that. In the Ottoman Empire, inspectors had authority not just over measurements, but morality. A mutisib might also ensure no price gouging, no lying about flour type, no selling stale bread without proper disclosure. And if he caught someone violating any of these codes? Let's just say the punishment wasn't limited to a quiet citation. There are reports of bakers being paraded through the streets holding their substandard bread above their heads. Some were made to stand barefoot in front of the mosque during Friday prayer, loaves hung around their neck like shameful medals. One famous case involves a baker found using chickpea flour to cut his wheat, without a license. His sentence? Public caning and a year-long ban from baking bread for anyone except his own family. His reputation? Toast. But the mutisib wasn't just a tyrant. The good ones were respected, even feared with a kind of reverence. They kept order, prevented famine fraud. In many cases, the people themselves demanded stricter inspections. Bread, after all, was political, religious, and emotional. If a poor family got sick because their daily ration was undercooked or weighed light, that wasn't just a domestic mishap. That was a civic betrayal. It gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. The mutisib wasn't acting alone. Behind the scenes, he was backed by mufettisler, roving informants, often former bakers or failed apprentices turned whistleblowers. They blended into markets, eavesdropped in bakery alleys, watched from mosque windows. If you were under suspicion for fudging your flour or trimming your crusts, chances are they already knew. The mutisib simply came to confirm. There's even one case, recorded in a palace archive, of a baker who tried to bribe a mufettis with 6 extra loaves a week. The informant took the loaves, nodded sagely, then reported the bribe and got the baker shut down. The loaves? Eaten in evidence. You look over at the apprentices. They're sweating more than the ones working the ovens. The mutisib's voice breaks the silence. Soman Kirk Dort. Loaf 44. A basic family loaf. He picks one up, sniffs it, then, shockingly, tastes it. This is rare. Tasting means suspicion. He chews slowly. Swallows. Pauses. Then, in the lowest voice possible. Kuru. Dry. He scribbles a note. That's a strike. Not a fine, yet, but enough to put the bakery on watch. If they get another complaint this week, they could lose their ration license. The head baker looks like he's aged 10 years in 10 seconds. What's strange, though, is how the rest of the bakery just keeps going. Once the shock of the inspector's entrance fades, the rhythm picks back up. Dough is kneaded, shaped, docked, brushed, and loaded. You realize they've done this before. Dozens of times. Maybe hundreds. It's like a fire drill, but with yeast. And always looming in the back of their minds? The memory game. The inspector could quiz them. No warning. Just point to an apprentice and demand they list the weights and sizes of loaves 28 through 35. Or ask for the difference between Saray Karegi and Asker Ekmeji, palace bun and soldier's bread. If you fumble? Penalty. And if you guess? You don't want to guess. There are even stories, half truth, half legend, of inspectors bringing decoy loaves with forged markings. They'd slip them onto a bakery rack and wait to see if anyone noticed. One apprentice passed with flying colors after sniffing out a fake loaf 22 by weight alone. He was promoted to second in command the next week. His nose became famous in his quarter. They called him Buren Bey, Mr. Nose. The Mutisib finally snaps his ledger shut. There's a collective inhale, as if everyone's been waiting for permission to breathe. He nods once, says nothing, and leaves. You don't realize you were holding your breath until your lungs burn. The moment he's gone, laughter erupts, not joyful, but the kind of manic relief that comes after a brush with disaster. Someone slaps the apprentice who made the dry loaf on the back. Could have been worse, he mutters. He could have tasted number 65. You don't know what loaf 65 is yet, but you're starting to suspect the numbers don't just mean sizes. They mean history. They mean danger. They mean the next inspector might not be in such a good mood. The laughter fades, replaced by the groaning creak of kneading tables shifting under new pressure. You've seen the inspection, felt the sweat of the workers, watched that little brass scale tip toward catastrophe, and now, you're starting to understand why bakers treated those 87 sizes like scripture. You mess one up, and your livelihood could vanish like steam off a cooling loaf. So how do you memorize 87 exact bread sizes? You're about to find out. It starts with the book. One apprentice beckons you to a side chamber, a quieter room with low shelves, a flickering oil lamp, and a thick layer of flour dust over everything. He gestures to a large leather-bound volume resting in a wooden box. The cover bears the symbol of the Istanbul Ekmeksi Kesai, the Istanbul Bakers Guild, a simple sheaf of wheat flanked by 2 rising loaves. You're looking at the register. This isn't some recipe collection. It's a ledger, a codex, a legal document, holy in the eyes of the guild. And inside? Every one of the 87 recognized bread sizes, listed, diagrammed, described in exacting detail. Dimensions, weights, flour types, moisture thresholds, and even crust texture. You open to a random page. Loaf 51, Caravanserai Tesai, the Caravanserai stone. Wheat barley mix. 348 grams. Flat and wide. Must measure the length of 2 cup palms laid side by side. The crust? Medium firm. No cracking. Must not leave more than 3 crumbs when halved. 3 crumbs. You blink. The apprentice grins. Don't worry. They teach us how to count them. This is where it all begins, memorization training. Every apprentice goes through it. A daily ritual. Some liken it to prayer, others to brainwashing. Either way, it works. You sit on the floor beside a younger boy, maybe 10 years old. His eyes are heavy with sleep, but he recites. Loaf 8, market oval. Weight 312 grams. Width 1 fist. Height, half a date stone. Score 1 line diagonal. He pauses, blinks twice, and continues. Loaf 9, market oval large. Weight 358 grams. It goes on. And on. Like a chant. Like a lullaby only an Ottoman bakery could sing. They use tricks, of course. Mnemonics, songs, even stories. Loaf 33 is known as the widow's round. Legend has it a baker's wife shaped it during a siege using only leftover flour and tears. Loaf 45 is cousin's crust, supposedly named after a guild member's cousin who couldn't bake, but could eyeball weights better than any scale. These aren't just jokes. They're memory anchors. One clever method? They arrange the loaves into families. The worker set, loaves meant for soldiers, laborers, and delivery boys. The prayer set, special breads baked before dawn, consumed after prayer. The Sultan's tears, a sequence of loaves increasing in refinement, from commoner to noble to court kitchen. There's even a song. It sounds like a lullaby, slow and rhythmic, with a repeating refrain. 40 grams, no more than that. With sesame stripes like a cat. You catch a line about a loaf so light. Even the breeze must not carry it away. And another about a heavy bun. That must humble the thumb. It sounds ridiculous. But it sticks. You find yourself mouthing the lines under your breath. The repetition lulls you. You're beginning to see how they do it, not just through rote memory, but ritual. Each loaf isn't just memorized. It's performed, embodied, practiced until it becomes muscle memory and instinct. Still, there's pressure. One apprentice admits that he wakes up some mornings in a panic, thinking he's forgotten loaf 76. Fisherman's Flat. A sea salt heavy bread sold dockside. He's not even assigned to it. But the fear lives on. Once a month, the guild conducts formal tests. Bakers are quizzed in pairs. They're shown dough samples and asked to identify the loaf. They're blindfolded and asked to smell or weigh by hand. Sometimes they're asked to make a loaf from memory in under 5 minutes. It's brutal. More than one career has ended on those floorboards. And the punishment? Well, it starts small. Fines. Temporary suspension from baking certain types. But if you fake knowledge, if you bluff a loaf and pass it off as legitimate, that's where things get nasty. There's a word for it. Candermack. To deceive. If you're caught Candermack ing, intentionally misrepresenting a loaf's identity, you're not just expelled. You're disgraced. Publicly. Your name written on the bakery wall under a black X. Your access to yeast revoked. Some claim even your dough bowl is ceremonially broken. There's a dark tale passed among apprentices about a man who tried to simplify the 87 into a universal dough, a base he could modify slightly to imitate any of the others. A shortcut. Smart, right? He lasted 3 weeks. Then, during a routine check, the Matisib noticed 3 loaves, numbers 14, 27, and 49, all shared identical internal air pocket structure. Dead giveaway. They arrested the man. Confiscated his ledgers. His name was scratched out of the guild record. Some say he fled the city. Others say he was forced to work the ovens forever without ever touching dough again, just tending the fire. A fate worse than exile. But here's the twist. No one agrees why there are 87 sizes. Not 80. Not 100. Not a tidy round number. Historians still argue whether the list evolved organically, as need and context demanded, or whether it was deliberately capped at 87 to correspond with some forgotten set of principles. Religious? Geometric? Bureaucratic? There's even one wild theory suggesting it matches a forgotten calendar system with 87 important feast days. The guild won't say. You ask the apprentice? He shrugs. There's always been 87. That's how the world works. And in this world, he's not wrong. You run your fingers along the edge of the register. Every loaf a law. Every variation a risk. You try to imagine waking up each day with 87 exact specifications bouncing around your head, and one more thing constantly lingering behind them. The knowledge that getting loaf 53 wrong could mean never being allowed to bake again. You gently close the book. And hope to heaven no one asks you about loaf 65. The door slams open again, but this time, it's not the Matisib. It's worse. 3 men stomp into the bakery, boots clacking on the flour-scattered tiles, all wearing heavy cloaks and suspiciously spotless aprons. Their hands are empty, but you get the feeling they're always close to sharp objects. They don't smile. They don't greet. They just look, one glance around the room, one long, slow exhale, and every baker in sight tenses like a cat near a bucket of water. The head baker's jaw clenches. He mutters a single word under his breath, almost like a curse. Tada Kali. That's when you realize, these guys aren't here to buy bread. They're from the rival guild. You've entered the world of loaf espionage. Now, it sounds silly, doesn't it? Espionage. For bread. But you'd be surprised how much power dough carried in the Ottoman Empire. In a city as hungry as Istanbul, where even a whisper of unfair grain distribution could start a riot, information was currency. And the bakeries? Well, they were full of secrets worth stealing. These newcomers work for a bakery in Tadakali, a market district famous for its bustling stalls, shady dealers, and the kind of loaves that look perfect on the outside but weigh just a gram under regulation. The tension here isn't just about economics. It's personal. Generational, even. Rival guilds often operated like mini-cartels, watching each other, sending informants, even bribing apprentices to leak recipes or ingredient ratios. Some scribbled notes about fermentation methods into code. One group in Galata allegedly used false flour sacks, double-layered cloths with hidden compartments, for smuggling proprietary yeast strains. Yeast smuggling. Yes, that was real. Guild records from the late 1600s mention a trial where a baker was accused of yeast theft. Not for personal use, but for sale to a rival bakery that had lost its sourdough starter during a flood. The thief supposedly stored the borrowed yeast in sheep bladders to keep it alive. He was fined, flogged, and banned from using wild fermentations ever again. Here in this bakery, the rivalry simmers hotter than the ovens. One of the visiting men picks up a cooling loaf and runs a thumb across the crust. Another flips over a soman with the confidence of someone used to inspecting enemy products. No one stops them. To interfere would be to escalate. But the body language of every worker here screams one thing: don't touch that loaf. These inspections, of course, are unofficial. Not government-sanctioned like the Matisib. These are spy visits, designed to rattle nerves and maybe gather just enough intel to recreate a competitor's top-selling crust. Maybe they're looking for a new kneading technique. Maybe they're comparing sesame seed placement. Or maybe they're just here to show dominance. The head baker finally speaks, his voice low and careful. If you're here for the taste, we sell at dawn. Come back with coin. The leader of the trio smirks. We already sell better. Oof. That lands. This isn't just about loaves. It's about reputation. In the Ottoman guild system, honor mattered as much as flour quality. A bakery could lose its clientele overnight if another claimed its loaves were misshapen, stale, or underweight. Sometimes these accusations were true. More often they were sabotage. There's one recorded case, again, real, of a baker being accused of using gypsum powder to lighten his dough. The rival bakery provided evidence, a single white speck, found in a loaf delivered to a noble household. The accused denied everything. Claimed it was flour clumping. Historians still argue whether the speck was real or planted. Whatever the truth, the baker's shop was shuttered for a month. That's ruinous in bread time. So, to protect themselves, some bakers started developing countermeasures. One legendary technique was the false bloom. It made loaves look puffier than they were, without adding extra dough. Just a scoring method and a particular oven angle that caused an exaggerated lift. Pretty? Sure. Legal? Technically. Ethical? Debatable. Others used mirror seedings. Special sesame or nigella seed patterns baked into the crust that spelled secret messages or symbols only guild insiders could read. One pattern warned of a counterfeit inspector in the neighborhood. Another indicated a sudden flour price hike. It was dough-based Morse code. The three Tatakali men finally set down the loaf. Their work is done, or so it seems. As they turn to leave, one of them leans in close to a young apprentice and says something under his breath. The apprentice goes pale. As the door shuts behind them, the head baker storms across the room and demands, "What did he say?" The boy swallows hard. He said, "They know we're hiding loaf 60. Silence. You've never heard a room full of grown men and teenagers collectively stop breathing. But here it is. Loaf 60. You finally ask, "What's loaf 60? They don't answer. Instead, one apprentice quietly walks into the storeroom. You follow him, past the shelves and the flour barrels, until he kneels by a hidden drawer under the floorboards. He lifts it open and reveals a single, cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside? A loaf. It's beautiful. Oval, perfectly golden, glazed with something shiny. It smells sweeter than the others. There's a hint of orange blossom and honey. The crust is laced with intricate scoring, almost calligraphic. It doesn't match any of the samples you've seen. It's clearly not on public display. That's loaf 60. The apprentice whispers. We call it the council's crust. Turns out, loaf 60 was once reserved only for guild masters and market judges. Its recipe includes luxury ingredients, extra yolk, clarified butter, spice infusions, and its weight is oddly specific, 365 grams. One for each day of the year. Symbolic. Perfect. Over time, the recipe was buried, locked away, limited to ceremonial occasions. But some bakeries kept it alive. Secretly. Quietly. Now, with flour prices high and customers getting pickier, the temptation to bring it back is growing. The problem? Selling it without permission is treason. Literally. Loaf 60 is restricted by imperial decree. If the Tatakali bakery exposes this place for secretly baking it, guild trial, fines, possibly prison. You stare at the loaf. A forbidden masterpiece. It gleams like something too perfect to eat. And suddenly you understand why rivalries get ugly. Why yeast is smuggled. Why apprentices get poached like rare birds. In a world where one loaf can bring in 100 clients, or end your entire livelihood, every gram is a secret. And in this bakery, secrets don't stay hidden for long. You barely have time to step away from the secret drawer before it's closed again, covered with a bag of millet like nothing ever happened. The head baker gives the apprentice a look, a silent warning that says don't even breathe the number 60 again. But the moment passes, the energy shifts, and the ovens reclaim everyone's attention. Still, attention lingers in the walls. And then you hear it, a low thrum, distant at first, but growing louder, a rising chorus of shouts, boots slapping cobblestones, and the unmistakable scrape of something wooden dragging across stone. You edge toward the window. It's happening. A bread riot. Out in the alley, a crowd is forming. Mostly women. Some older men. A few children tagging along. All yelling about something. You hear phrases like, too small, short wait, and, he's lying, check the crumb. A few wave loaves above their heads like protest banners. One woman holds hers high and screams, this is not 644 dirhams, I'd stake my daughter on it. Someone lobs a loaf like a brick. You turn to the head baker. That's normal? He sighs. It's Tuesday. In Ottoman Istanbul, bread riots weren't just occasional. They were practically a civic institution. Everyone knew the rules. If bread prices went up, if loaves shrank even slightly, if someone claimed that a baker was hoarding flour, boom. Crowd. Screaming. Stale bread projectiles. You name it. In 1590, there was a full-blown riot in Üsküdar over mislabeled crusts. A rumor started that some bakers were disguising stale bread by rebaking it with fresh glaze. Within hours, 5 bakeries were looted, 2 mutisibs were cornered in a bathhouse, and the Grand Vizier had to issue a public proclamation stating, loaves shall be marked anew, and any crust forgery shall be punished. Yes, crust forgery. It's an actual legal phrase. The thing is, bread wasn't just food, it was justice. Every loaf symbolized fairness, consistency, divine provision. For the average Ottoman, who didn't have much control over taxes, war, or palace intrigue, bread was the one thing you could measure, see, taste, and get mad about when it was wrong. And that anger was holy. You remember how Islamic tradition considers feeding the poor a sacred duty. That tradition ran deep. Many Ottomans believed that a baker who cheated on weight wasn't just scamming his neighbor, he was defying God. That's not a metaphor. It was a literal belief. If you sold short loaves during Ramadan, some scholars argued you were invalidating your fast. And if you gouged prices during famine? Oh boy. Eternal consequences. There's a story, half historical, half folktale, of a baker in the 1700s who tried to get clever during a grain shortage. He shaved his loaves just enough to avoid suspicion. But word got out. Within days, the crowd dragged him to the mosque steps, dumped flour over his head, and forced him to eat his own bread uncooked. They called it divine justice. Whether it really happened or not, historians still argue. But that tale is still told. With relish. Back at the window, the crowd has surrounded a delivery cart. The poor guy running it is trying to explain he's just the driver. But no one's having it. An older woman grabs a loaf, holds it up to the sun like a jeweler inspecting a gem, and yells, "This wouldn't feed a cat." Cheers erupt. A group starts chanting. Someone rolls a barrel into the street and lights it on fire. And just like that, the situation is one ruined sourdough away from full-blown chaos. You hear a baker mutter behind you. They haven't even tasted the loaf. They're just mad it feels light. It's funny, and not funny. Because in times of unrest, even small bread discrepancies were seen as part of a bigger pattern. If a loaf came up short, maybe the flour mill was hoarding. Maybe the guild was corrupt. Maybe the Sultan was raising taxes again. Even if it wasn't true, that feeling was real. And dangerous. Which is why the imperial government treated bakers almost like civil servants. They were heavily regulated. Subsidized. Sometimes even protected, just enough to keep the peace, not so much that they got cocky. But not always. In the mid-18th century, Sultan Mahmud I reportedly stormed into a bakery district during a riot, demanding to know who baked the loaves everyone was complaining about. When he found the bakery, he personally weighed the loaves and, legend says, threw one into the Bosphorus with a snarl. That bakery was shuttered for a full season. The baker? Vanished. No one knows what happened. Official records just say, removed. You turn back to the crowd. They're dispersing now. A few elders have shown up, possibly mediators from the mosque. They calm the shouting, offer some spare bread, and promise a guild investigation. A few loaves are redistributed. The fire is stomped out. Crisis contained. But barely. Back in the bakery, the head baker sits with his back against the wall, drinking tea like it's medicine. They're getting hungrier, he says. Flour is tighter this month. Price went up. Nobody believes us. You glance at the loaves on the table. They look fine. Smell amazing. But if the people don't believe they're fair? That's all it takes. One misweighed bun. One cracked crust. One loaf that doesn't feel right in the hand of a woman who's fed 6 kids with nothing but soup and bread for 2 weeks. And the streets go red with flour. It's not just about hunger. It's dignity. It's fairness. It's the one thing every Ottoman, rich or poor, agreed mattered every single day. And that's why bakers memorized 87 sizes. Because messing up loaf 31 might not just cost you your job. It might burn the whole city down. The fire from the street's been stomped out, but the heat inside the bakery is far from over. The air still buzzes with that tense, powdery silence, like everyone's trying to forget the riot almost happened. But no one says it out loud. You get the feeling they're used to this. Like bakers in this city carry the weight of the empire in every tray they slide into the oven. The head baker motions for you to follow again, this time to the back, past the storerooms and away from prying eyes. He unlocks a small wooden door that creaks like it hasn't opened in weeks. The room is cold. Quiet. Sacred. No fire. No shouting. You've entered the bread vault. It sounds more dramatic than it is. And yet, somehow, it is dramatic. This isn't a room for storing flour. Or coins. It's a room for loaf lineage. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, each containing what look like bread-shaped bricks. Old, shriveled, petrified loaves, each sealed in cloth or wax, some cracked with age. Others sit in glass boxes, labeled in looping Ottoman Turkish script. These aren't props. They're archives. You crouch beside one and try to make out the label. Ekmek number 17, Subi Saminu, 1632. Officer's loaf. Supposedly the regulation bread for mid-rank military officers during Sultan Murad IV's campaign years. It's about the size of your hand, but flat, crust heavy, and baked to endure. Likely edible for 3 weeks. Maybe. This entire vault is a testament to memory. Not memory in the way you remember your cousin's birthday, but institutional memory. Baker's memory. Government memory. Guild memory. You begin to realize, this is how they kept the 87 sizes consistent. They preserved actual examples. Historical benchmarks. Because parchment descriptions can warp. Scales can shift. But a loaf? A loaf is eternal. Well, at least until the mold wins. Some of the samples are. Let's just say you wouldn't want to eat them. One sits in a copper mold, encased in a clear lacquer shell. Another looks fossilized, like it's been exhumed from a dig site. A third is scorched, with a singed edge and a tag reading, "Fire of 1711 survived." The head baker lifts a sample gently from a shelf. You see that it's wrapped in cloth stitched with tiny symbols. "This," he says quietly, "is loaf number 3. Peasant's ration." It looks plain, underwhelming, but it's surprisingly heavy in your hands. A dense, barley-forward hunk of caloric security. "Most loaves were adjusted over time," he says. "But this one? Hasn't changed in 400 years. It's humbling. Every one of the 87 had a relic. An origin. A perfect version that the guild locked in this vault like the imperial family locked away relics of the prophet. Not because bread is holy, but because if you get enough people to believe it is, you don't need to explain why it matters. They just feel it. And then he shows you the weirdest item of all. A book. Bound in cracked leather, dusty as a winter chimney. But inside? Sketches. Hundreds of them. Loaves, yes, but also measuring tools. Wooden rings. Wire grids. Finger diagrams. There's even a chart comparing the height of a loaf to the width of a pigeon's foot. Why? Who knows? Possibly for street sales. Possibly an elaborate prank by a guild scribe who'd had one too many cups of arrack. Historians still argue whether some of these tools were ever actually used or just theorized, kind of like Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines. But the guild copied every idea, every design, and archived it. You get the sense that nothing was forgotten here. Just buried. Catalogued. Watched. One particularly odd relic stands out, a tray of mold samples. Yes, actual mold cultivated from loaves gone bad, labeled by season, region, and type of flour. You read one label. Black Fuzz, Kütahya, late spring 1740, barley base. Another reads, Green Bloom, Adrianople, early autumn, safflower tainted batch. Why keep these? You ask? The head baker shrugs. Mold tells truth. How fast it grows. How bread breaks down. It's like reverse aging. A bad recipe reveals itself by the way it rots. There's a brutal elegance in that. You're standing in a room full of ancient bread, mold charts, pigeon foot diagrams, and the intense, unspoken rule that none of this ever leaves the bakery. It's knowledge that can't be taught in one day. Or a year. It's knowledge that's inherited. And if you were wondering, yes, this place is protected. A small lockbox sits on the corner table. Inside? A set of sealed samples that would be sent directly to the palace in the event of a major guild dispute. A kind of bread-based legal case. Say one bakery accused another of deviating from official loaf size 66. Silk merchant's flute. They'd request a tribunal. And the vault would send the reference loaf, escorted by guild marshals, like it was a crown jewel. No joke, there are records of these proceedings. A famous one in 1753 involved a flour cartel secretly diluting wheat with sawdust, yes, sawdust, to increase margins. The guild launched an investigation and used the vault loaves to compare texture, air distribution, and water absorption. Turns out, the counterfeit loaves had a grain shimmer. The light caught just a little too much reflection on the crust. The offending bakery was shut down, and its oven demolished in the town square. Not a fine. Not a slap on the wrist. Demolished. Why so dramatic? Because every mismeasured loaf wasn't just a mistake. It was a breach in the social contract. A lie made edible. A broken promise you had to chew through while feeding your family. That's why the vault existed. You look around again, seeing the relics not as crusty museum pieces, but as legal witnesses. Silent, stale, sacred. You ask if anyone outside the guild's ever been in here. The head baker gives you a look. You're here. Good point. Before you leave, you notice one shelf that's been completely cleared. Only a small plaque remains. Reserved for loaf 88. 88? You ask about it. He just smiles. There is number 88. Never has been. Never will be. And somehow, that's the most unnerving thing you've heard all night. You step out of the vault, blinking as you return to the glow of the ovens, the rhythm of the rolling pins, the soft slap of dough hitting wood. Everything seems normal again, until you notice the customers outside the bakery door are waiting, but not buying. They're just watching, leaning against walls, tapping their feet. One guy fidgets with a coin like it's burning a hole in his palm. You nudge an apprentice. Why aren't they buying? He sighs. They're waiting until the bread cools. You blink. Why? He shrugs. It's the rule. And just like that, you tumble into one of the strangest, most hotly debated practices in Ottoman bread history. The ban on buying hot bread. Yes, you heard that right. There was a time, and in many districts for many decades, when it was officially forbidden to purchase fresh, hot bread straight from the oven. You stare blankly. But isn't that the whole point? The apprentice smirks. You'd think. It seems counterintuitive, even cruel. The smell of just baked loaves hangs heavy in the air, fragrant and hypnotic, like edible perfume, and no one can touch them yet. You watch people fidget in line, some pacing like they're trying to outwalk their cravings. One woman squints into the bakery, probably wondering if anyone's daring enough to sneak a bite early. But no. They wait. Because once upon a time, buying hot bread was seen as dangerous. It wasn't about burns. It wasn't even about fairness, though that played a part. It was about riot prevention. You remember those bread mobs from earlier? Imagine if fresh bread came out of the oven, and the richest buyers swept in and bought half the batch while it was still crackling. Everyone else would lose their minds. No one wants to wait 2 hours for crumbs. So, in many cities, Ottoman authorities decreed that loaves had to cool down before sale. The idea was that if everyone had to wait, everyone had the same chance. A simple rule. Impossible to enforce. And yet the guilds tried. You're told that inspectors would randomly check bakeries mid-morning, touching loaves to see if they were still warm. If any customer was caught tucking into a steaming soman on the spot, the baker was fined. Repeat offenses led to temporary closure, or in one bizarre case, forced donation of a dozen free loaves to the local mosque for culinary sins against the community. Historians still argue whether the rule was about temperance, or if it was just bureaucratic overreach. Some say it was a moral regulation, meant to curb greed. Others say it was practical. Hot bread spoils faster, sweats in storage, and turns soggy if wrapped too early. There's even a fringe theory that it was tied to fasting customs, since hot bread smells could cause resentment during Ramadan hours. But here's the kicker. Not everyone agreed. Some districts ignored the rule. Others flipped it entirely. In Bursa, for instance, street hawkers were encouraged to call out fresh bake times, drawing crowds with the promise of steam still rising. That's why regional riots sometimes broke out over bake schedules. People moved cities based on bread rules. Marriages reportedly collapsed over whose neighborhood sold the better-timed loaves. One janissary wrote that, "My bride's bread district ran later than mine, and I knew we would never be one." Dramatic? Yes. But in a society where bread is breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Not that surprising. You watch now as a new batch comes out of the oven. The head baker barks. No sales until second bell. A bell? You didn't even know there was a bell system. Turns out, many guild bakeries used actual metal bells, or, in some areas, percussion blocks, to time the cool-down phase. First bell, loaves pulled from the oven. Second bell, loaves cooled to acceptable sale temp. Third bell, optional final leftovers go to charity. It was all about order. Still, not everyone followed the rules quietly. There's a famous tale from 1722 involving a wealthy merchant who bribed a baker for hot bread before sunrise. The baker agreed, reluctantly, and passed a still steaming loaf through the alley window. Unfortunately, a passing Neophytus, you remember those roving informants, spotted the illicit exchange. The baker was caught, fined, and publicly forced to bake loaves for 2 weeks without pay, each one branded with the word Sikoxi, or hot cellar. That word stuck like a stain. For years afterward, the alley was known as Sikoxi Sokagi, Hot Cellar Street. You can still find it today on old maps of Fadi district. But people being people, they found ways around the rule. Some started bringing bread cloths, soft linen wraps embroidered with cooling charms. They'd buy the bread as soon as it was legal, wrap it tightly, and scurry home to recreate that just out of the oven bliss. Others developed the reverse sneak, sending kids to knock on bakery doors during the baking process pretending to ask about salt, hoping to swipe a corner of crust on the way out. It was the Ottoman version of counter-surfing. You spot a little girl outside doing just that. She peeks in, grins at an apprentice, and holds up her basket. He waves her off. Rules are rules. But even as you chuckle, you sense the deeper layer. This wasn't just about bread. It was about controlling the flow of emotion tied to scarcity. Hot bread wasn't just delicious, it was primal. It was fuel. It was comfort. If it was sold unfairly or too fast, people felt cheated. And cheated people revolt. Even the word for bread, ekmek, comes from a root meaning to gain or to earn. It's not just food. It's value. And in Ottoman times it had to be earned. That's why you hear the expression whispered as the bell finally rings and the customers step forward. Sagimasini bekoki barakiti gelsin. Wait for it to cool, so its blessing arrives. One by one, the loaves change hands. Warm, but not hot. Blessed, but not spoiled. And you start to realize, every rule, no matter how strange, had a purpose. Even the one that made people wait for the very thing they came running to buy. The bell's echo fades, and the line outside the bakery melts away like butter on warm crust. Loaves pass from calloused hands to cloth-wrapped baskets. Some are tucked beneath arms like prized possessions, others are held out for children to sniff like they're checking for magic. Maybe they are. For now, the streets are calm. Order has returned. Inside, though, there's still work to be done. You follow a flour-dusted apprentice as he slips through a side hallway and disappears into another chamber, low-ceilinged, dimly lit, lined with odd shelves filled with dusty scrolls and cracked ledgers. It doesn't smell like a bakery anymore. It smells like old books and paper glue and something faintly musky. You've entered the realm of calorie quotas. Here's the thing, in the Ottoman Empire, bread wasn't just sold. It was tracked, measured, evaluated against who you were, where you lived, and how many calories you were supposed to be consuming. You didn't just eat bread. You were issued it. You're staring at a wall covered in wooden boards marked with tally lines, dates, symbols. Each district, Fadi, Galata, Üsküdar, has its own chalked-up board. Each one tracking not money, but loaves. And above all of it, carved into the wooden header in flowing calligraphy, Adalet on le Basler. Justice begins with flour. It sounds lofty, but the Ottomans meant it. You see, the state had a deep interest in making sure everyone had enough bread. And not just enough, exactly enough. Soldiers, servants, dock workers, mosque caretakers, scribes, they all had rations, carefully measured and enforced. The empire had developed what modern historians cheekily refer to as an early calorie calculator. Here's how it worked. Each worker class had an expected caloric need. That need was translated into grams of bread per day. Those numbers were published in guild records, court ledgers, and palace archives. If a man worked 6 hours doing physical labor, he might receive a ration of 3 loaves per day, each of a specific type, say, loaf 26 the workers pull apart. An imam in a mosque? Maybe 1 lighter loaf per day, plus a weekly honeyed bun. And if you were a palace eunuch? Well, then you were getting the high-end stuff, silk flour refined loaves that left no crumb behind. One particularly fascinating record from the reign of Sultan Selim II lists daily rations for 5,000 palace workers. Not only does it break down loaves by size, It even specifies the crumb texture, citing softness fit for elderly teeth. Yep. Ottoman calorie calculations didn't just look at weight, they looked at chewability. Quirky fact? In some neighborhoods, bakers had to adjust their recipes seasonally, because it was believed people needed heavier loaves in winter to guard against the cold. So you might find loaf 54, the winter dome, in heavy circulation from November through March, then replaced by its fluffier cousin, loaf 55, once the tulips bloomed. Some of this was superstition. Some of it wasn't. You flip through one of the old ledgers and find a peculiar diagram, a circle labeled Average Ottoman Male Caloric Output, surrounded by wedges representing wheat, barley, beans, and olive oil. At the center? A symbol for bread. In huge, bold script. Bread was the foundation. Always. And it wasn't just for individuals. The empire used bread as a tool for population control. You read that right? Every bakery had to report its flour usage, loaf output, and sale quantities weekly. That meant the state could estimate how many people lived in a given district, not from a census, but from bread math. If a neighborhood's loaf consumption spiked, the government might assume a surge in population, possibly due to migration, births, or unregistered visitors. If numbers dropped, maybe famine, or exodus, or worse. It said the palace had an entire office dedicated to analyzing these numbers. Kind of like a modern-day analytics team, but instead of web traffic, they were tracking crumbs. One official even coined the phrase, Ekmeko Kanusin Siher Yalan Soilames. A city that speaks in bread does not lie. Which sounds beautiful until you realize it means your bakery receipt was effectively state surveillance. You look again at the chalkboards. Every tally, every number, every name, coded into the wall like a nutritional conspiracy. One name appears frequently. Sirak A. Yusuf. Apprentice Yusuf. You ask about him. The baker chuckles. He eats like 3 men. Throws off the numbers every month. Even the guild scribes couldn't predict a growing teenager. But the real jaw-dropper? Bread was used to track loyalty. During times of unrest, wars, revolts, regime changes, bakers were quietly instructed to report any unusual orders. If someone was stockpiling loaves? Red flag. If a household suddenly switched from 5 loaves to 10 a day? Red flag. There are documents showing that entire rebel cells were sniffed out by watching who bought more bread than they were supposed to. One rebellion in Thessaloniki allegedly collapsed because a baker noticed 3 unfamiliar men buying Sultan tier loaves every day, despite dressing like poor tradesmen. Their mistake? Crust preference. They couldn't help themselves. So yes, bread was fuel. But it was also a fingerprint. One scribe, possibly sarcastic, possibly sincere, once wrote in the margins of a bread ledger, "Show me what he eats, and I'll show you who he plots for." And that was no joke. You suddenly see the 87 sizes in a new light. Not just culinary variety. Not just bureaucratic precision. But a way to assign identity. Control movement. Track bodies and bellies across a sprawling empire. And yet, somehow, it worked. You step out of the chamber and back into the smell of baking. The loaves still rise. The apprentices still recite their memorized specs. But now you understand, every crust is a line of code. Every crumb, a data point. And somewhere, someone with a feathered quill is counting them all. You haven't even settled back into the main bakery floor before someone whispers, "They're on their way." You blink. Who? The apprentice just points to the back corridor, where 2 men appear in perfect synchronization. They're dressed in fine, dark robes with white trim, each wearing an expression like they've never once smiled at a joke. In their hands, silver trays, a pouch of spices, and most ominously, a folded white cloth embroidered with the tugra of the Sultan. You step back. It's time for the imperial taste test ritual. Yes, this was a thing. A very real and very bizarre tradition where representatives of the palace would perform taste tests of guild-standard loaves, both as a form of quality assurance and a way to assert dominance. think Michelin stars, but with the ever-present threat of arrest if the crumb didn't meet expectations. These two are Taddockseiler, official palace tasters. They don't speak much. They nod to the head baker, who bows, not deeply, but just enough to show respect without appearing desperate. That's important. You have to walk the line here. Too much reverence, and you look weak. Too little, and you're suspected of hiding something in the crust. The test begins. The tasters sit at a small marble table near the cooling racks. One unfolds the embroidered cloth and places it like a sacred mat. The other selects 3 loaves, one large, one small, one specialty, and sets them carefully in front of the cloth. Then, with a tiny knife shaped like a half-moon, he slices off a precise sliver from each loaf's heart, the inner crumb. Not the crust. The inside. Because that's where a baker's true skill shows. He lifts the first piece. Inhales. Closes his eyes. Chews. The room holds its breath. He swallows. Nods. Repeat for loaf 2. But loaf 3? He pauses. His nose wrinkles. Just a twitch. His brow folds like origami. He chews slower. Looks to his companion. Then he says, "Hint of ash." The head baker's face freezes. One of the apprentices fumbles a flour bowl. Ash? Ash? The Tadixi continues. From the oven wall, perhaps. The right side is burning too hot. Everyone exhales a breath they didn't know they were holding. Crisis averted. This wasn't sabotage, it was an oven quirk. Fixable. But it's a warning. The kind that keeps bakers up at night. One unnoticed scorch, and your name might end up on the palace's blacklist. Because yes, there was a blacklist. The palace maintained a confidential record of bakeries that failed taste tests more than twice in a year. Fail 3 times, and your bakery lost its license to sell imperial-grade loaves. That might not sound like a big deal, but in a city like Istanbul, being palace certified was the difference between being swarmed by customers at dawn or ignored completely. So every baker aimed for perfection. The Taddockseiler rise, pack their tools with priest-like solemnity, and leave without a word. As they go, one slips a folded slip of paper to the head baker. He unfolds it. Smiles. 2 stars, he says. You blink. Stars? Turns out, they did have a rating system. It wasn't published, but every bakery was scored, quietly. 1 star meant you followed the rules. 2 meant you followed the rules beautifully. 3? That was legend. Only 6 bakeries had ever received 3 stars in the past 2 centuries. One of them? Burned down under mysterious circumstances. The others? Protected by elite janissaries. Literally. There's a legend that the Sultan's kitchen once dispatched a team of bodyguards just to escort a tray of ekmek yıldızlı, 3-star bread, from Istanbul to Edirne. One of the guards ate a corner en route. The baker was informed. And furious. He refused to bake again until the soldier wrote an official apology in bread dough. You ask the head baker if that's true. He shrugs. Who knows? These stories rise like yeast. Sometimes real, sometimes not. But here's something that is real. The palace had its own bakery. Hidden inside the Topkapi complex. The Daruziev, or House of Feasting. It produced a limited run of elite loaves only for royal use. These loaves had unique classifications, not part of the standard 87. That's right. There were unofficial bread sizes, known only to the palace. Loaves with names like Gulhamur, rose soft, infused with dried rose petals and honeyed flour. Serhasir, nightcap, given to viziers for late-night strategy sessions. Altın Karinti, golden crumb, made with saffron and almond oil, for diplomatic banquets. They were never sold publicly. Recipes weren't written down. Bakers assigned to the Daruziev signed oaths of secrecy. Violating that oath? Treason. That's not hyperbole. There's an actual case in 1767 of a former palace baker selling imitation, golden crumb, loaves in a private shop. He disappeared a week later. His oven was found cold. Forever. Which brings you back to the tasting ritual. This wasn't just quality control. It was a reminder. A performance. A demonstration of the invisible thread connecting every humble bakery to the glittering court at the top of the hill. A loaf might be born in the fire and flour of a street shop, but it answered to the Sultan. Even the word used for loaf quality, haysiyat, meaning dignity, or honor, was the same word used in court trials. That's how seriously they took it. You look around the room now with fresh eyes. Every tray. Every scrape of the paddle. Every whisper about whether a crust bloomed too wide or too shallow. It's all part of a vast, edible bureaucracy. One bite can raise your rank. Another can destroy your trade. And somewhere in the palace, a record of this day's test will be inked into a scroll, archived beside reports of wars, famines, and treaties. Because here, a loaf isn't just something you eat. It's something you test. Something you prove. Something you serve. The scrolls don't rest long. As soon as the imperial tasters vanish and the head baker tucks away their slip of judgment, another set of figures appears, less elegant, more ink-stained. Scribes. 3 of them, hunched like vultures over bundles of parchment and ledgers, their fingers permanently smudged with soot and molasses. One carries a jug of thick syrup that immediately worries you. Another sets down a tray of drying ink tablets. The last pulls a roll of paper from his sleeve that unspools like a tail. You've arrived at one of the most bizarre corners of this flour-dusted universe, the world of bread bureaucracy. You thought the 87 sizes were complicated? Oh, friend. Those were just loaves. Now we're diving into the documentation of loaves. See, in the Ottoman Empire, everything had to be written down. Production, distribution, fines, flour intake, even yeast sourcing. If a loaf existed, it was recorded. Not just weighed and measured, but scribed. Each day's bake was registered in official logs, with columns for bread type, by number and name, quantity produced, variations allowed, within 0.5 gram, ingredients, including flour origin, sale window timed, notes, excess sesame due to supplier miscommunication. And yes, those last bits were real. The notes section sometimes became its own little drama. You lean over the scribe's shoulder and read. Loaf 32 appeared pale, possible low oven heat. Investigate coal supply. Apprentice memmed responsible. Observe his technique. Oof. That's basically a passive-aggressive performance review in loaf format. But these scribes weren't just secretaries. They were watchdogs. Members of the Defteriakmek, the bread ledger office, who were tasked with maintaining city-wide consistency and preventing creative accounting. It wasn't unheard of for bakers to fudge numbers, claim they baked fewer loaves to avoid quotas, or more, to justify flour usage, or invent entirely new loaves. That's where the syrup comes in. You watch, stunned, as one scribe ladles a line of syrup across the edge of a fresh register page, then folds it in half, pressing gently. When he opens it again, the sticky line has bonded the 2 sides perfectly. It's their version of a seal. Any tampering? Rips the page. Evidence of fraud. This level of paranoia wasn't paranoia for fun. It had history. One case from 1679 tells of a rogue scribe in Ayap who altered flour quantities in the ledgers by changing numbers from 2. The Arabic numerals for 7 and 8 differ by 1 dot. That dot inflated weekly flour purchases by hundreds of kilos. He skimmed profits from the excess for nearly 6 months before another scribe noticed ink inconsistencies. That scribe? Promoted. The fraudster? Banished to a grain silo near Van. Literally. Still, mistakes happened. And occasionally, they were hilarious. You're shown a record, nearly infamous in the guild, where an entire quarterly bread census had to be redone because someone spilled syrup across the main scroll. Not just any syrup. A thick, rose-petal molasses that turned the numbers to soup. The culprit? An apprentice tasked with delivering halva to the record office. He tripped on a cobblestone, lost the tray, and dumped dessert all over 2 months of loaf data. The result? A full week of recounting every bread batch from scratch. Literal door-to-door surveys. Did you eat loaf 44 last week? How many? Describe its crust in 3 adjectives. Some people lied just to mess with the clerks. Others asked if they'd get extra loaves for good answers. But it gets even weirder. Scribes also documented customer complaints, using a system of bread-based metaphors. Crust too sharp might be code for price felt high. Dough sweated could mean delivery was late. Loaf collapsed might imply someone's mood, not the bread. It turned the ledger into a strange emotional barometer, tracking the mental state of a neighborhood by the performance of its dough. One famous complaint from 1732 reads, "Bread of loaf 61 was bitter. Like news from a cousin who visits only when hungry." Poetic. Also deeply specific. You ask whether these complaints ever led to real changes. The answer? Sometimes. The Guild had a quarterly review where scribes presented loaf sentiments. Based on their findings, recipe ratios might be tweaked. Baking schedules shifted. One loaf, loaf 29, the Merchant's Fold, was discontinued entirely after 3 seasons of negative notes. Too dry, too thin, bad luck. Gone from the roster. Just like that. You peer into the drying rack, where fresh pages now wait in the open air, fluttering slightly as apprentices pass. The ink smells faintly of walnut and vinegar, homemade, long-lasting, bitter. Like the words it holds. And it's not just guild scribes. There were imperial scribes, too, who would periodically audit the guild's own records. Like watchdogs watching watchdogs. These audits were high-stakes events. The bakery had to produce a full trail of breadcrumbs, literally and figuratively, to show how each loaf type was produced, priced, and sold. One document, the Account of 85th, named for loaf 85, became famous after a disastrous audit in 1804, where a scribe accidentally switched the flour type for loaf 85 with loaf 52. The result? A noble family allergic to barley received a full week of it. No one died, but the legal fallout was enormous. Loaf 85 was blacklisted for 2 years. The scribe's career? Reduced to recording bean weights in the imperial soup kitchen. Still, some scribes got poetic. You find one fragment on yellowing paper. Loaf 12 bloomed beautifully this week. Warmth clung to its sides like a promise. A widow bought 2, saying the crust reminded her of her husband's shoulders. That's not bureaucracy. That's literature. Somewhere between the lines, you sense that some scribes loved their work. Not just recording, but preserving stories. Through loaves. Through lives. Before you leave, one apprentice points out a shelf lined with black-laced ledgers. "What are those?" you ask. He leans in. "Rejected loaves." Turns out, not all proposed bread types made the cut. When a baker tried to introduce a new size or variation, it had to go through a formal petition process. Some made it into the 87. Others were deemed unfit, overseasoned, underleavened, too fancy, too French. There's even a rejected loaf that included grape skin infusion. They called it wine loaf. A cleric intervened. Loudly. It never saw the oven again. You walk away from the scribes humbled, confused, slightly amused, and a little sticky from syrup mist. You realize now, the 87 sizes weren't just shapes or weights. They were chapters. And the scribes? They wrote the bread's biography. You're back in the warm bakery now, but somehow it feels colder. Not temperature-wise, your shirt is still sticking to your back from the oven's breath, but in tone. Maybe it's the realization that every loaf has been tracked, tested, archived, recorded in syrup, whispered into palace scrolls. You start to see the bread differently. You used to think of it as food. Now it feels like surveillance with a sesame crust. An apprentice brings you a round, dense loaf. Loaf 43, the tax officer's round. It's heavy. Unsalted. A bit sour. For perspective, the apprentice says dryly, Try eating the whole thing while staring at your annual levy notice. You laugh. Then stop laughing. Because he's not joking. You're about to learn how bread and taxes were tied together tighter than a knotted dough braid. Let's set the table. In the Ottoman Empire, taxation wasn't just gold coins and ledgers. It was edible. And bread, being universal, measurable, and essential, was the perfect currency to tax, track, and sometimes spy with. You start with the basics, the ekmek resmi, literally. Bread tax. Yes, it was a thing. Not a tax on bread purchases, though that existed too, but on production, measured in units of flour and expected loaves. Guilds were taxed per batch, per oven, per head of apprentice. Some districts even taxed oven heat output. A hotter oven meant more efficiency, more loaves, therefore more taxable potential. And don't think you could fake your numbers. The Matisibs, those terrifying inspectors, had authority to crack open bakery records and audit flour-to-loaf ratios. If you bought 200 kilos of flour and only reported 400 loaves baked, they'd assume you were hoarding. Or worse, selling on the black market. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Because taxation wasn't just from bread. It was sometimes paid in bread. Yes. Loaves as legal tender. In smaller towns or during coin shortages, local officials accepted bread as payment for fines, fees, and tithes. One record from a village near Amazia shows a man paying off a land registration fee with 19 loaves of loaf 21, the garden soft, delivered over 3 days. Did he bring a receipt? Absolutely. Written on the back of a flattened loaf wrapper, signed by the clerk with a waxy walnut stamp. Weirder still, some taxes were calculated based on bread prices. That is, your annual land tax might fluctuate if bread prices went up or down. Why? Because bread prices reflected inflation better than any gold standard. If the price of a common loaf rose by 15%, chances were something bigger was broken: grain imports, caravan routes, harvest cycles. Bread became an economic barometer, baked daily. One imperial memo from the 18th century states, "Bread never lies. Its weight and price shall guide the imperial treasury." You can almost hear the finance minister wiping flour off his hands as he wrote it. But there's more. The Ottomans also used bread consumption to estimate wealth. How? By tracking bread diversity. Let me explain. If a household consistently purchased only one loaf type, say, loaf 10, the dockworker's crunch, they were considered modest income. 2 or 3 loaf types? Middle class? 7 or more variations in a month? Wealthy. No one needed loaf 70, the minted silk loaf, unless they were throwing palace-adjacent brunches or seducing a vizier. So, tax officials quietly watched these patterns. One poor merchant in Edirne bought 10 loaves of varying types over 2 weeks. A gift for his daughter's wedding, apparently. His name went on a list. 2 weeks later, he received a notice saying his import license was being reassessed due to potential unreported income. Coincidence? Probably not. And then, there's the most curious application of bread as tax policy, the loaf for loyalty system. This was unofficial. You won't find it in palace law books. But you'll hear it whispered by bakers. Certain neighborhoods, especially restive ones, received extra bread days. A secret deal, fewer fines, bonus rations, lower prices, in exchange for political calm. Imagine this. You live in a poor quarter. One day, loaf 47, the royal filler, normally double price, starts appearing at standard rate. No explanation. People smile. Tempers ease. Complaints quiet. In the background, the local governor beams. Because cheap bread is good politics. A former scribe-turned-poet even wrote a line about it. You don't need soldiers if the crust is generous. Of course, the reverse was also true. Cut the bread supply, raise the prices, or reduce ration sizes, and unrest was inevitable. Several uprisings across Anatolia started not with weapons, but with loaves tossed at tax collectors. One riot in Aleppo was sparked when someone noticed that loaf 36 had shrunk by half a finger width. The tax office claimed it was an oven glitch. The public didn't care. A nearby guard was hit in the helmet with a seeded crust, and the city burned for 3 days. And here's the fringe theory of the evening. Some scholars believe the 87 loaf types were intentionally crafted to function as income tier identifiers. As in, if you bought loaf 14, you were part of the labor class. Loaf 55? Educated. Loaf 78? Minor nobility. It was like a delicious social code. A way for tax officials and spies to identify status just by watching a breakfast table. Historians still argue whether this was planned or just a happy coincidence. But the idea lingers. You suddenly think back to all those customers in line, waiting politely for the second bell, each walking home with different shaped loaves in their baskets. Not just carrying dinner, carrying data. It hits you. Bread was a daily referendum on who you were, what you owed, and whether the state trusted you. It was your ID, your invoice, and your income report, wrapped in linen and topped with nigella seeds. You take another bite of that tax officer's round. It tastes dry. But underneath? It tastes like obedience. The oven's rhythm slows now. Not because the day is done, far from it, but because twilight is creeping in, and twilight has always brought out the stranger parts of any city. And tonight, Istanbul is no different. There's something in the air. You feel it in your teeth, in the flour dust on your skin. Something old. Odd. Unmeasured. You're sweeping crumbs off a bench when an apprentice murmurs, "Time for the final batch." You nod, expecting another flurry of dough and shouting. But instead, the mood turns whispery. The loaves coming now aren't listed on any of the chalkboards. There are no measuring rings, no taxiler. These aren't official loaves. They're enchanted. Welcome to the world of curses, charms, and dough magic. You thought 87 sizes was complicated? You haven't met the 88th, the invisible one that lives in every rumor, every superstition, every bite that tastes a little too lucky. It starts with the flour. One of the bakers moves to a private cabinet in the corner, unlocking it with a key strung around his neck. Inside, sacks of unusual grain. One bag is marked with blue ink, shaped like a crescent over an eye. "Evil eye resistant," the apprentice says solemnly. "Wheat harvested on a moonless night." You blink. He's serious. Turns out, Ottoman bakers, especially in older districts, kept an entire underground tradition of flour folklore. Superstition so specific they made astrology look casual. Harvesting wheat during a solar eclipse? Bad luck for 40 days. Grinding grain near a graveyard? Loaves will weep while baking, yes, that was a term. Milling at midnight under starlight? Perfect for fertility bread. You start to understand why some bakers never smiled. They were managing not just yeast and temperature, but the invisible world. And then there's the yeast. If flour was the body, yeast was the soul. And in Ottoman lore, it could be possessed. Some bakers swore that sourdough starters took on the mood of the household. An angry baker? Sour, bitter crumb. A grieving one? Dense loaves, no rise. A baker in love? Perfect springy bounce. To protect their starters, bakers hung charms, tiny cloth bags filled with herbs and written prayers, above their fermentation jars. Others burned dried lavender near the dough bowls to calm any lingering spirits. One particularly dramatic tradition involved whispering secrets into the sourdough as it bubbled. "Tell it something you fear," they'd say, "and it will rise with you." Quirky tidbit: in some guilds, if your starter died, i.e., stopped fermenting, you had to bury it in the earth with a short prayer, facing Mecca. Not because it was religiously required, but because it was socially expected. You don't just dump dough down the drain. That's how you get ghosts in the oven. Or so they claimed. There were love loaves too. Baked with a strand of hair or a drop of rosewater, shaped like hearts or knots, these were quietly passed from bakery apprentices to market girls. Some loaves had names carved into them, usually initials, scrawled in blade-thin scores across the crust. If the recipient sliced the bread and ate it without noticing, it was said they'd fall in love within a week. If they did notice, you were doomed. One scandalous record from 1743 mentions an apprentice dismissed for smuggling affection loaves to 3 different women. Each loaf had the same crust signature, M.A. No one knows who M.A. was. But all 3 girls showed up on the same day, demanding an explanation. The explanation? Bread doesn't lie. But not all dough was sweet. Some was cursed. The so-called Bakir Kabis, the copper nightmare, was a feared tale passed around among senior bakers. It involved a cursed loaf that caused ovens to explode, dough to rot mid-rise, and customers to weep uncontrollably after eating it. Supposedly, it originated from a baker who defied the guild and tried to create loaf 88. He failed. Now, bakers refuse to assign the 88th slot. It remains blank, omitted from every record. Because 88 isn't just a number. It's a challenge. And some challenges are best left unbaked. Still, you see remnants of these magical practices everywhere. One baker pats his loaves 3 times before they go in the oven. Another kisses the paddle's handle. A third draws a tiny spiral on each raw loaf, a sign, he says, to confuse bad spirits. And the customers? They believe too. Some request dream crusts, light, open crumb with a thin top, said to bring peaceful sleep. Others buy baraka buns, spiced rounds thought to ward off bad luck, often carried in coat pockets during exams, weddings, or long sea voyages. One woman buys only 3-day bread, loaves deliberately overbaked, meant to last until her sailor husband returns. She says the longer it stays fresh, the safer his journey. It's probably superstition. It's definitely love. And then there are the fortune loaves. Once a year, during the spring festival of Hidderelas, certain bakers are permitted to make special loaves with hidden charms inside. Tiny metal tokens wrapped in parchment, a coin, wealth, a flower petal, marriage, a pepper seed, trouble, a clove, healing, and so on. You don't choose your loaf. You just buy. And slice. It's like edible taro. There's a famous story of a scribe who bit into a fortune loaf, found the pepper seed, and, terrified, immediately transferred to a provincial outpost to avoid urban misfortune. He tripped over a goat his first week. Broke his hip. Retired. The pepper seed had spoken. Of course, historians today roll their eyes at all this. There's no evidence, they say. Just folktales. But even modern scholars admit, the guild never formally banned magic baking practices. They didn't need to. Because bread lives in both worlds, the measured and the mysterious, the weighed and the whispered. As night deepens, you watch the last enchanted batch cool on the rack. Soft loaves scored with symbols no inspector would ever check. One has a swirl like a galaxy. Another looks like a spiral of stars. The apprentice doesn't label them. He just smiles. No numbers for these, he says. They remember themselves. And you believe him. The city has gone quiet now. Not the eerie, unnatural silence of something wrong, but the gentle hush that settles over a place finally at rest. The fire in the oven has dimmed to coals. The apprentices are stretched on flour sacks or slumped against cool stone walls. No one speaks above a murmur. And you? You're following the head baker down a narrow corridor, one you didn't notice before. It feels older than the rest of the bakery, as though carved from memory more than mortar. He doesn't say where you're going. You pass walls blackened from centuries of smoke. A faded painting of a loaf surrounded by stars. And finally, a heavy door with iron studs and a curved top. He opens it slowly. Inside is a room that feels like a vault. Not for bread this time, but for stories. Worn scrolls. Ancient paddles hung like battle relics. A mural depicting a crowd gathered in a square, fists raised, not in celebration, but in fury. Above them, a cart overturned, a baker on his knees, loaves scattered like coins. This, the head baker says quietly, is where the numbers ended and revolution began. You've arrived at the tale of crumbs and chaos, when the cracks in the crust tore open something much bigger. It started, of course, with a loaf. Not just any loaf, Loaf 74, known as Sesame King. A wide, ornate round, topped generously, almost lavishly, with golden seeds. Prized by the wealthy. Coveted by the middle class. Tolerated by the guild, but barely. Why? Because it was always skirting the line. Too heavy. Too showy. Too tempting. And one day, during a particularly tight season, grain shortage, bad harvest, the usual chain reaction, a baker in the Saitsad district began selling Loaf 74 without approval. Not just selling it, pushing it. Undercutting prices. Stashing flour from other batches. Baking by night, selling before the second bell, even offering it hot. The other bakers noticed. So did the Matisib. An audit was scheduled. The rebellious baker was warned. He laughed. Let them weigh the sky if they want, it won't feed them. A very bad answer. Word got out. Soon, his bakery was swarmed not by inspectors, but by neighbors. Customers. Angry, envious, hungry. They wanted Loaf 74. They didn't care if it broke the rules. The riot that followed wasn't massive, not at first. But it was loud. 3 other bakeries were looted in retaliation. The Matisib was pelted with stale buns. And then someone, maybe a merchant, maybe just a furious mother, dragged the forbidden loaf through the streets on a spike, shouting, "Is this what we can eat?" It went viral, in the 18th century sense of the word. The palace responded with force. 2 bakeries closed. 5 apprentices arrested. The rebellious baker disappeared, some say fled, others claim he baked one last loaf and jumped into the Bosphorus. But the damage was done. People began questioning the 87. Why these loaves? Why not more? Why must a loaf weigh 332 grams and not 334? Why should a hungry family wait for the second bell while officials taste sesame-laced crusts behind velvet curtains? The riot of Loaf 74 wasn't about just bread. It was about the illusion of fairness. One pamphlet, smuggled from district to district, quoted scripture next to loaf weights, implying divine disapproval of overregulation. Another simply printed a giant 88, with no context. A number with no loaf. And that's when the guild realized, numbers can't hold back revolution. They tried to respond. Rebranded a few loaves. Recalibrated moisture limits. Gave out extra holiday buns. Too little, too late. The uprising faded, but the cracks never fully sealed. That's why even today, Loaf 74 is treated carefully. It's still made, technically. Still weighed. But rarely served without a sideways glance. And the 88th remains absent. It's not that no one's baked the 88th. Many have. In secret. As art. Protest. Personal expression. But never officially. Never written down. Never added to the register. Because once you name it, you claim it. And then you risk everything that comes with letting the crust fall outside the scale. The head baker walks to a shelf and picks up a small, palm-sized loaf. It's round, unmarked, plain. This was made the night before the riot, he says. Loaf 88. They called it the unmeasured. No seeds. No score. No number. He offers it to you. You take it. It's lighter than you expect. But somehow heavier than all the ledgers, relics, and scrolls you've seen. This isn't about the size, he says. It's about the silence. You realize then, every rule has its ghost. Every measurement its shadow. The 87 sizes exist because the world needs certainty. But the 88th exists because certainty is always a little bit fake. You return to the bakery, the last coals glowing faintly. The apprentices sleep. The ledgers are closed. The loaves are cooling. Tomorrow, the cycle begins again. And the 87 will rise as they always do. But the 88th? That one will stay hidden in a drawer, or whispered to a lover, or burned at the edges of a forgotten recipe. Because not all loaves are meant to be weighed. Some are just meant to be remembered. So now we slow things down. Let the ovens dim to their final embers and the flour settle like soft snow across the tiled floor. The guild ledgers are closed. The apprentice whispers have gone quiet. Outside, the streets of Istanbul stretch under the hush of a sleeping sky. No more riots. No more measuring rings. Just the scent of baked sesame carried on a breeze that winds between moonlit minarets. You're lying on a cool bench now, belly full of bread and stories. Maybe your fingers still smell faintly of yeast and something ancient. Maybe your breath even carries a trace of anise or molasses. Doesn't matter. You've made it. You've stepped through time into a world where crusts carried laws and crumbs sparked revolts. Where the perfect loaf was a matter of dignity, and weight was as sacred as prayer. You've learned the difference between loaf 12 and loaf 43. You've felt the fear of the mutisib and the thrill of forbidden flour. You've seen the vault, the scribes, the secret codes, the superstition. And you've held the 88th loaf, if only in thought. Now let that thought fade. Let your heartbeat slow to the rhythm of cooling dough and distant market bells. The city sleeps. The bread cools. And you? You're drifting now, past the last page in the ledger, past the last crumb on the table, into dreams of ovens that never burn and loaves that always rise. Good night, baker. Sweet dreams.